Excellent. Okay, so good evening to those live and on screen. As per usual, actually, I'll post the link to the handout for those who are online, and I'll put it in the link to the YouTube recording also. Okay, so I wanted to look this week at finish off the topic of civilian casualties and proportionality, which we began 2 weeks ago. Unfortunately, I missed last week, and try and have a look at a very important shuvah from a sefer called Amud Hayomini, who is Rabbi Shaul Yisraeli, who was a very important posek, Rosh Hashiva in Merkaz Harav, and an important posek in the Dati Lomi world, who dealt extensively with, in this particular shuvah, in Shuvah Tesayin, with the ethics of, with some of the ethics of war, and in particular, discuss this in the context of the action of Beirut in Beirut. I think it was called Operation Free Galilee, the 1982 invasion of South Lebanon, or taking over South Lebanon, the expulsion of the forces of the PLO at the time, and he dealt extensively with some of these halachas. So that's I just wanted to sort of learn through parts of his tshuva. It's a very, very lengthy tshuva. It goes to 20, 30 pages. I just tried to extract some of the I think some of the key points. And the background to this is that that war has its own moral code. We saw this already near the end of the first year and looked at this in more detail in the second year. The normal rules of interpersonal action sort of don't quite make sense in the context of war. In war, a person is obligated to risk their life to fight, even to risk their life to save someone else, if that's what the demands of war is. Normally, there's the principles of don't give up your life unless it's for the shalosh avos chamoros, for the three most significant or three so-called cardinal sins. In war, in private life, if I occupy someone else's house, I am a thief. In war, there's conquest of war. There's Dinei Malchus, in which one can capture enemy territory and it can be taken over by another country. The spoils of war are considered to be legitimately the possession of the conqueror. So law has in halacha its own dynamics. One of the possible consequences of this is that a war takes place between nations, not between individuals. And as such, sometimes civilians can get caught up in the war, and the necessity of war means that they are also attacked. And we saw one source for this. This is printed on the top of page 1 in the handouts. And again, I'll just post the link for those who are online who haven't got it. We saw one source for this in the in the fight between Shimon and Levi on the one side, and the people of Shechem on the other side after the kidnap of Dinah. And the Rishonim struggled to understand the behavior of Shimon and Levi. Indeed, Yaakov himself criticizes Shimon and Levi for behaving the way they do. And how can it be that the whole town of Shechem in some way has collective punishment for the actions of Chamor, the prince of Shechem? So the Rambam and the Ramban try and deal with this, and they explain there's some degree of guilt of the inhabitants. The Maharal says we don't need to go down that path. This is war. This isn't just an individual fight. This is a fight between the proto-nation of Israel, the family of Yaakov, who are now developing into a little nation, and on the one side, on the other side are the people of Shechem. When there's wars, this is what happens. And Reb Shaul Yisraeli is of the view that this Maharal has halachic significance. Reb Shlomo Goren, who was the chief rabbi of Israel at the time, having served as chief rabbi of the army beforehand, he disagrees with this. He says you can't establish halachic principles from the Maharal on a comment, on a midrashic comment, on a story in the Torah. This isn't the basis of a sort of a halachic principle. But Reb Shaul Yisraeli believes that this is a source for the concept of a war. A war is between nations. A war is not between individuals, and as such, sometimes civilian population are affected. Again, translating these halachic concepts to the current conflict is not a simple idea, and we know that Israel is doing its best to minimize civilian casualties. Nonetheless, sometimes civilians will be tragically and sadly affected by a necessary operation against the enemy. And rather than viewing this as a war perhaps between Israel and Hamas, it's a war between two nations. Hamas is the government of Gaza, for better or for worse, tragically for worse, elected by its people to some degree in following Israel's withdrawal from Gaza in 2005. This is a fight between nations, and when there's a battle between nations, civilians tragically can sometimes be caught up in the conflict, and this is the way it goes. Let's spend a little bit of time there just looking at some of Rabbi Shaul Yisraeli's points, and I think it's just worth us learning through. And this is the table that I did or the box I did in source 4, from his She'elot Teshuvat Sefer, the Amud Hayimini. And I can't emphasize enough, this is an exceptionally lengthy source, and I've really just tried to paste some ideas from it. So in the first box, he says that if the population are inactive, they in no way take part in the crimes, but nonetheless are supportive of the crimes and encourage them, but they do so out of fear. Everyone would agree everyone would agree that they're not quite as complicit as if they're choosing to do so. Nonetheless, it may well be that they are responsible for this. And this is part of a piece in which he discusses to what degree ones, being forced to do something, removes moral culpability. So we have a halacha in the Torah that if someone holds a gun to your head and says, break Shabbos, we break Shabbos, the action is considered ones, it's considered compelled, and therefore not your responsibility. However, if someone holds a gun to your head and says murder, one is culpable for that to some degree, because who says that my blood is redder than your blood? Who gives me an exemption from, who allows me to make the decision that I can save my life at the expense of your life? And therefore one has to give up one's life for it. Nonetheless, the Rambam is of the view that if one transgressed this and one did commit a murder in order to save one's life, one is still ones, one was still forced to do so. One did so out of compulsion, and therefore one can't be considered fully culpable. So in this passage, Rabbi Shaul Yisraeli discusses the degree of responsibility of someone who acts out of compulsion, out of force, and secondly, whether there is a difference in this area between Jewish and non-Jewish response to force. One of the reasons why we are allowed to break halacha at threat of life is because of the mitzvah of the chai bohem. We have an obligation to live through doing the commandments. Is this applicable to the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach or not? Is this applicable to the 7 Noachide commandments? This is the piece that he discusses. Let's have a quick read through box 1. This is source 4 in the middle of page 2. He says, it turns out based on this, if the whole community, the whole enemy community, turn their eyes away from the murderous acts, the other rabba, on the contrary, encourage them. They have a justification and an excuse. They can't object out of fear. Let's not forget, this is these are a terrorist-run government where people are afraid. If they're afraid of death, everyone would agree they're exempt. If they're not afraid of death, but they will be persecuted or imprisoned, he says this is an argument between the Rambam and the Ramban. Their degree of culpability is not so clear-cut. Either way, he says, it comes out, he says this is not, he doesn't believe this is sufficient moral justification, or halachic justification, to take action against civilians because of the degree to which they are complicit in the criminal terrorist activity of their overlords, because they're doing so out of fear. So he doesn't consider this a justification. In box 2, he says, as I've been told, I've been informed, the border villages, Arab villages, Nosenas Michsa Midas, they choose to provide shelter, to the murderous terrorists, even in a case where they could do so without punishment. So they're choosing to do so. And in the next paragraph, he discusses the concept of rodef. Now, in halacha, I am allowed to act in self-defense, and I am even allowed to act in defense of a third party. So if I witness A chasing after B, I'm allowed to defend B by taking out A, if that's the only way to defend, because A is a rodef, a pursuer. And he therefore discusses in this piece whether a pursuer means literally only the one who is pursuing, or also someone who has indirect causation, known in halacha as groma, indirect causation, whether they can also be viewed as a rodef, and therefore for its self-defense justifies taking them out. Self-defense would justify the killing of the pursuer. So without again going too much into the halachic background here, the concept of indirect causation is one that you may meet, for example, in Hilchas Shabbos or the like. And he says the logic of it makes sense when we are working out the realm of mitzvah and avera. There's a difference between directly engaging with an act and facilitating an act. However, in the concept of rodef, he says it doesn't make a difference. Whether you are the one who are chasing or whether you are the one who is enabling, you are nonetheless a rodef, and he therefore believes that a population who are complicit in murder, albeit not the perpetrators, also self-defense would justify them being impacted, them being killed. In the next box, which is really the third box in source 4, nearing the end of the page, he speaks about war ethics, which we really touched upon earlier, and he said even though in normal times culpability should be dealt with on a one-by-one scale, each person should have to be taken to court, and we should work out whether the person is guilty or innocent. And even in Hilchas Rodef, in taking out the pursuer, the halacha is that if you can defend B, who is being chased by A, by rather than killing A, shooting them in the leg, so that they can no longer chase without killing them, that is the appropriate action. He says, even though in normal times this is appropriate, in war, the context of war on a practical level makes this impossible, and halacha accepts this reality. This is the concept of war between nations, and again, he references us back to war having a slightly different code of ethics to regular times. Then, in the next few boxes, he speaks about something more difficult, more sensitive, I would say, and this is collective punishment and revenge. Does the Torah recognize the legitimacy of revenge against civilian population? And this is really where Rav Shlomo Goren took issue. And Rav Shaul Yisraeli is of the view that revenge attacks are justified. He says it is true that in normal civilian life, the Pasuk repeatedly says, "Lo yumsa ovis al bonim bonim," we don't punish children for their parents' sins. But when you are fighting a battle, you are dealing with a collective. And therefore, if innocents suffer in that collective response, so be it. How can we live with it morally? And the answer is, once this is the appropriate thing that needs to be done in the context of the battle, then we need to trust and view this as an event that occurs bidei shamayim, in the hands of heaven. And as we live in a world in which we do see innocents tragically dying, I mean, we see that in as a result of crimes like terrorist attacks, and we see that just for all sorts of reasons. We see innocent children tragically and beyond painfully having diseases and illnesses and dying of those. So we see that b'dei shamayim, Hashem has his own calculations for how human affairs work. We humans can't justify that. A person can't go around, a court can't go around saying, okay, we're okay sentencing innocent people. It's all in God's hands. That's ridiculous. However, in the context of war, where sometimes war involves collective action, and yes, that involves the death of civilians sometimes, since the war demands that, how do we live with this theologically? We understand that this is onesh b'dei shamayim, this is heavenly punishment, and this is how heavenly justice sometimes works, and we should be okay with this. And he says that on occasion when this was instructed by a novi, Even deliberately, this could be done. And he cites the example of Moav, when Klal Yisrael went into battle against Moav. Even women and children were affected, even civilians were affected. How all men had to be put to death and so on. How can this be justified? How can this be the case? He says, because once you have a Novi, if you have a prophet instructing this reverts back to Dinei Shemaim. This is again the heavenly system of running the world. The heavenly system of running the world, God has his own calculations, his own way of operating. We don't need to. We know that sometimes this happens. This is acceptable. Rav Shlomo Goren disagrees. He says this is Moav. This is a one-off exception. You can't extrapolate this to any other circumstances. And this was a debate within, in many ways, two of the most senior poskim that dealt with these issues. And this is his conclusion. We'll just look at his final words, which is in the box, in the middle of page 2. Labeled conclusion. He says the conclusion is there is a place for revenge operations against the enemies of Israel. And this is part of Milchamas Mitzvah. I should have perhaps reminded ourselves preceding this that there are two categories of milchama that we spoke about, of war that we spoke about in the last shir. One was milchamas reshus, a voluntary war, for example, long-term self-defense or economic growth or the like. But then there's milchamas mitzvah, which is a defensive war. He is of the view, as are many of the Rishonim, that milchamas mitzvah even applies nowadays, even though classically it needs a king to do a milchamas mitzvah. A king is simply the executive, and any executive authority, such as the Knesset, can declare a milchamas mitzvah. In his earlier points, he says, the truth is it's irrelevant whether this is a milchamas mitzvah or not. Either way, it's a war of self-defense, and wars are sometimes justified. This is a justified war, even if it's not technically a milchamas mitzvah, and therefore this is allowed. And he says, Kol also in the second line in the box, Kol also any accident or attack that occurs on the poem, the terrorists and their partners and their children, we should view the terrorists as responsible for this. They will bear the sin of this. We don't have to refrain from revenge attacks against the terrorists, even though this will affect innocents. So not only is it included in self-defense to take out terrorists because of fear of future attack, but even to avenge them, that's part of a war. Part of a war is taking out the enemy, and even when it's not literally self-defense at this moment, in other words, even if they're crippled and they will be unable now to attack further, nonetheless we can sow justice, and if they or their innocents involved reap the consequences of this, this is their fault, part of their responsibility, and therefore we are not responsible for this. And this is pretty much his halachic conclusion around this subject. Interestingly, there is an earlier source for such a concept, and this is a brisa. So we're looking at a Tanaitic statement that appears in Maseches Sofrim, in which Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says that even innocent oppressors can be affected, can be killed. Sorry, even innocent enemy nationals can be killed. And Tosfos, this is source 5. Tosfos is going on a Gemara in Avodah Zarah, and the Gemara in Avodah Zarah says that we should not go around taking the lives of pagans, even though they have a value system which we consider profoundly corrupt. The language of the Gemara is lo moridin. One doesn't lower them into a pit. In other words, one shouldn't imprison or generate the death of a pagan, even though we disagree strongly with their values. Asks Tosfos in source 5, the Im Toma, if you will ask, in Maseches Sofrim, this Tanaitic source, it says, even a innocent Canaanite kill. Answers Tosfos, based on the Yishalmi, we explain, this is at the time of war, and he brings a proof for this from Paro, who recruits horses, Vayikach Sheish Me'as Rechev. He takes 600 horses and chariots to chase after Bnei Israel, after the Israelites, when they leave Egypt. Where did he get the horses from? Surely they all died in the plague of Borod, in the plague of Dever, the pestilence that killed the animals. Explains the Gemara, these are the Ksherim, the ones who listened to the words of Hashem and hid the animals away and therefore weren't affected by the plagues. And then these same people volunteered to allow their horses to be used to chase the Jewish people when they leave Egypt. So you see, at the time of war, we don't need to give the benefit of doubt to civilians. A civilian who might end up complicit, unfortunately, this is a consequence of war, that you don't have the ability to start trying each individual. And therefore, whilst one tries to minimize casualties, one needs to accept that there will be more significant casualties than under times of peace. Okay, so what we have said so far are the classic sources that we have on this subject, including a classic teshuvah from Rabbi Zobin and Rabbi Shlomo Goren, in which they try and assemble what we know about it. Just to summarize what emerges from this discussion, number one, ethics shifts in wartime away from civilian conflict. In civilian life, you have the luxury of dealing with individuals. In war, you're dealing with collectives, and yes, there's a price to pay for that, number one. Number two, part of that price is accepting civilians killed in an attempt to get the combatants, to get the enemy, to get the terrorists. That's principle number two. Principle number three is included in legitimate war aims is revenge against terrorists, even if they cease to be a threat. It is legitimate in war to take revenge, and therefore, since this is a legitimate war aim, even the death of civilians in the process of doing this can be justified, and we need to live with that. And number five, enemy civilians who are supportive of terrorist activity, albeit not actively engaged in it, so they are not participants in terrorism, but are supportive of terrorists, should also be viewed as culpable and are legitimate targets, according to Rabbi Zobin. However, civilians who are forced to be supportive out of fear for their own lives are not legitimate targets. That's a summary of Rabbi Zobin's views around this matter. Now, just taking us back to this sort of laden term of proportionate, as I mentioned last time, it's often understood as if it's often misquoted as if proportionality means somehow the strength of either side should be roughly matched, which is ridiculous. Why should the stronger side not take advantage of its military strength? Or as if somehow it means that the number of casualties on the other side should be approximately equivalent to the number of casualties on our side. So if 1,400 Israelis are murdered, somehow the war can only affect 1,400 Palestinian civilians. And this is not what proportionality means. If the war aims can be conducted with only 5 Palestinians killed, then any extra Palestinians killed is an immorality, is a breach of morality. There's no justification for the remaining 1,395. And on the contrary, if the war aims can only be conducted to a successful outcome with more civilians dying, then that's also within proportionality. So proportionality simply means that the number of civilians caught up on this should be proportionate to the war aims. So we first need to ask ourselves, are the war aims legitimate? And then secondly, is the outcome of those tragically caught up as collateral damage, in a sense, of this process, is this a legitimate proportional ratio? So this is what we find in international law. What defines what's proportionate? What is the proportionality? It's very vague. There isn't a clear definition. It's left to a common sense definition. The most we can do is perhaps look at the actions in recent conflicts, like Afghanistan and Iraq and places like that, where America and the UK seem to consider even hundreds of thousands to be proportionate to the war aims. In Afghanistan, we're looking at tens of thousands, in Iraq, hundreds of thousands, and they seem to consider that proportionate to the aim, to the war aim. Do we have a parallel concept of proportionality? We've seen in Rabbi Yisraeli's reading, and in this even Rav Goren agreed, that we do accept civilian casualties as a consequence of legitimate war aims when the war aim is legitimate. What is the ratio that's justified? So in source 6, I printed in the middle of page 2, from Rabbi Gleich in his Contemporary Halachic Problems, in which he writes, he's not aware of any Jewish source that discusses this. He's not aware of any classic source that defines is there a limit to this? How far can it go? So this is what Rabbi Bleich writes. He doesn't find a definition of proportionality. Rabbi Shali Israeli, and I printed this as a separate source in source 7 at the bottom of page 2. He says he thinks that the definition, a legitimate definition, is by whatever international standards are and whatever international law says. And he again, just to explain a complex idea in simple terms, he says we know there is a concept of dinah de malchus dinah. The law of the land is the law. What does this mean? That countries have to run themselves. We have a Torah, we have mitzvahs, but the Torah and mitzvahs don't tell us about the running of the country. Who runs the country? Who makes a decision whether to build a new motorway, a 3-lane motorway, or a 6-lane motorway, or a 5-lane motorway between two cities in Eretz Yisrael? Who makes a decision whether to continue quantitative easing or discontinue it when the economy is tanking? These are not Torah decisions. This is the role of the Melech. This is the role of the executive. In fact, we saw this is the role of the king in decisions about how to wage war, whether Milchemes Mitzvah or Milchemes Reshus. Someone has to make decisions. What's the best strategy? Do we get this military aircraft or that military aircraft? Do we enter from this side or that side? And that's the role of the executive. That's the role of the king. The concept of dinah de malchus dinah is that this isn't a uniquely Jewish way of running affairs. The nations of the world also are entitled and should and are expected to set up governments to run the country. Countries need to be run. And though there are certain halachic requirements about the function of the country, for example, the Sheva Mitzvahs and Noach, the 7 Noachide laws, beyond that, countries can use their discretion how to run a country. So do you make a £2 coin or not? Do you have a £5 note or only a £10 note? What should your coins be minted of? What tax regime should you have in place? How should the money be spent within reason? These are dinah malchus dinah, the law of the land is the law. The concept of malchus applies within a country to the running of the country. Rabbi Shali Israeli argues that in the same way as there is such a halachic concept intranationally, in other words, within a nation, there is also such a concept internationally. It's legitimate for the countries of the world to get together and form a international consensus about international law. That's also a legitimate way of part of the Siddur HaMedina, part of running countries. And he proves this. He demonstrates this. He brings halachic sources around international rules of conquest, we already mentioned that, and occupation, which halacha recognizes and legitimizes. And therefore he says there's a sort of meta dinah de malchus dinah, meta law of the land, which is international law. And therefore he says that what's considered proportionate and reasonable and justified in halacha is not defined. Halacha doesn't define it. Halacha has the concept, but the application of the concept is left to people to work out. It depends on strategic aims. It depends on what the moral standards of the generation are. It depends on what's seen as legitimate. And he says, in the same way as dinah malchus dinah, the law of the land is the law, doesn't apply if this is targeted unfairly at Jews, anti-Semitic legislation. In the 1930s, Jews don't have to wear yellow stars because of dinah malchus dinah. Similarly, on the international level, if the law is applied unfairly to Israel, this doesn't apply. But as long as the law is applied equitably and reasonably, he thinks that the concept of dinah malchus dinah should apply. So just to summarize, he's in a sense answering the mystery that Rabbi Bleich raises. We've seen that they're classic sources that accept civilians as tragically collateral damage in legitimate execution of war aims. What proportion is justified? Halacha doesn't apply. It doesn't define. Why doesn't it define it? Because that's something left legitimately to the executive to decide, like so many other decisions are left to the executive to decide. So it doesn't have a view on an ideal rate of inflation. It leaves that to economists to work out. Similarly, it's legitimate for either on a national or international level to be worked out what's a reasonable basis of proportionality, and that's what he thinks is the correct stance. So in brief, whilst we have halachic sources that see the concept of collateral damage and civilians tragically caught up in effective military action, the halacha doesn't really give a more detailed definition of where the ratio is. And Rav Shali Israeli suggests that that's something that would be equivalent to the concept of dinah to malchus dinah. I want to reiterate, as I said at the beginning of the last year, there's a danger in speaking about these topics because I'm conscious that we're talking whilst tragically Israeli soldiers are in Gaza carrying out operations, and sometimes perhaps in an attempt to correctly try and minimize civilian casualties risking their own lives. And therefore, it's very easy to sit here in the comfort of Hendon pontificating about these matters. And similarly and equally, there are the tragic deaths of innocent civilians in Gaza, and each one is a tragedy, and no halachic discourse is meant to minimize that. So whilst we're trying to deal with this on a halachic level, and I think it's appropriate to do so, I also want to recognize that on the ground, obviously things are much more complicated, and certainly I'm not privy to the decisions that are being made and how and why they're being made. I'm simply trying to bring as sort of broad principles some of the ideas that lie behind this matter. So I think, unless there are any questions from my point of view, I think we've discussed civilian casualties at sufficient length. Yeah, David.
I've been surprised, I should be surprised, that in all the comments about this, there's never any the slightest suggestion that the people of Gaza are in this. And according to the sources, we can attribute certain amount of complicity to them, but the non-Jewish world don't think they're civilians; they're completely innocent.
Yes. So for those online, I mean, the question is asking, why is there so little discussion about possible degree of complicity with Gazan civilians? And I agree with that. I mean, the Hamas government was voted in, whatever democratically means in the context of that part of the world. And Hamas still has a degree of support, significant support within the Gazan population. And again, it's difficult to know to what degree people are afraid for their lives and offering support. The best opinion polls seem to show that the support has declined since this operation. But yeah, there is some degree of moral culpability in people who elected a government that was committed to, in its charter, was committed to the destruction of Israel and still stands by that standard. So yeah, 100%. Okay, so that's again without going into the current conflict, which is too sensitive and too complex, and probably only maybe in a decade or so, maybe enough information will come out where we can really understand what happened. Those are some halachic sources. I put at the bottom of page 2 hostages ? And here I would like feedback from people. I was asked after the last chair, and a couple of people actually WhatsApped me to ask whether I would look at the issue of hostages in halacha. I feel a little uncomfortable dealing with it. As it is, I felt uncomfortable around this whole topic because we're talking about real live issues. But to discuss this when there's 240 odd hostages tragically still in captivity and so on, I struggle with trying to offer any sort of views on it, but I'd be interested in the week to hear what people feel, and if people feel it's appropriate, maybe it's something that we can look at next year. But that's for now. All I'm doing on my section hostages at the bottom of page 2 is 4 question marks, and I don't feel completely comfortable at the moment dealing with it. What I do want to now move on to, though, is looking at a little bit at the siege of Gaza and the halachic sources around calling for peace and siege warfare. And again, the sources I'm going to look at largely derive from halachic sources that dealt with the siege of Beirut, which I mentioned earlier. And the degree to which they are or are not comparable to the current situation in Gaza, again, is complicated. And therefore, I'm talking about principles. I'm not trying to apply it on the ground. I do want to say that I feel the claim that Israel somehow is laying siege on Gaza is outrageous. This is pre any halachic conversation. Israel is not laying siege on Gaza. First of all, Israel only controls 3 sides of Gaza. Egypt has a 4th side. Secondly, it's almost laughable, the idea that in the midst of a war, Israel should have to continue providing supplies to its enemies. And Gaza should have been and could be, and perhaps even is, for all we know, self-sufficient. Gaza sits over large aquifers. There should be enough water supply. It has an economy which is middle income. I don't know if people realize this. This is a middle income economy. It's not even close to being amongst the poorest parts of the world. It is a very dense population, that's true, but so are other perfectly reasonable places in the world to live in, like London. London is a very dense place to live. We may say London's part of a larger country, but then there's city-states like Singapore, like Hong Kong, which are very dense, like Monaco. And Monaco is far more dense than Gaza. And you can have a good quality of life in a dense part of the world. The idea that somehow it's a prison camp in an area that has beaches and pizza shops and villas with swimming pools and so on. Like any other part of the world, it has wealthier people and poorer people, and to a large degree, the inequalities that exist are because of the nature of their kleptocracy, the governance by theft. That is Hamas, a government which is complicit in digging up of water pipes to convert the metal into weapons, and therefore the idea that that somehow this is a siege. That why on earth should Israel provide electricity and supplies while it's in the middle of a war? And in fact, as it happens, as we know, Israel only cut off supplies for a short amount of time. And it seems to be weeks in which there's constant messages of we're going to run out of fuel within 2 days. We're going to run out of fuel within 2 days. Now, I don't say this out of lack of sympathy, and obviously every death of every civilian there is a tragedy ultimately, and this is not at all chas v'shalom to be blasé about the Palestinian misery. It isn't, but unfortunately that doesn't affect the morality of what Israel is doing. I also want to say one other point because there's been various questions around this. Israel, like any other nation, is not always perfect. It makes mistakes, perfectly capable of making mistakes. Some of its senior leaders spoke out of turn and in inappropriate ways at times during this conflict. And they're human, and people under stress speak out of turn. They're not the government, though. People can have say extreme things at times, but that doesn't reflect Israeli government's policy. And this is the first point. The second point is, what is it that allows us to be sure of the morality of Israel's actions? And the answer is because this is a democracy with a free press. And I can't reiterate this enough, the same soldiers who are now serving as tragically serving 19, 20, 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds and up are the same people who in 10 years' time will be right-wingers and left-wingers. There'll be journalists and there'll be lawyers and there'll be politicians. And the truth comes out. And we know after every other Israeli conflict, 10 years on, 20 years on, enormous amounts of information come out. And sometimes things that were wrong come out also. Not everything is perfect. But we know that there is no wholesale decision, God forbid, to cause the death of innocents. There's never been in any previous Israeli conflict, there's never been any indication of this whatsoever. Other things have come out. There's been individual soldiers and commandants who have behaved poorly. And Israel, as a democracy, has had the strength to try its citizens and its soldiers who have behaved poorly. And therefore, we can have every confidence that Israel is behaving appropriately. And if there are any areas in which mistakes have been made, these are a matter of wholesale policy, and these will come to light. So we know that. And therefore, and we also know that Israel is very concerned about the death of every civilian, both from a moral point of view and an international PR point of view. It realizes that every death limits the patience of the rest of the world's powers to continue these essential operations. Okay, so that said, let's have a little look at the concept of siege. And the first source that I printed here was on page on the top of page 3. It's from the UK Manual of the Law of Armed Conflict. It's a Ministry of Defence document. I should say I'm no expert on military of defence documents, and I don't spend my time downloading government papers. I saw this quoted. I hope it's accurate. If someone knows better than I do, please let me know. But I saw this in an article from a journalist who was speaking about these things. And it says, siege is a legitimate method of warfare. It would be unlawful to besiege an undefended town, since it could be occupied without resistance. But in the context of resistance, siege is a legitimate method of warfare. What do we know about this from halachic sources? So I don't want to spend too long looking at these psukim. We looked at some of them in previous weeks. But basically, there are three sets of commandments that we will focus on today. This is now the top of page 3, source 2. The first is Pasuk Yud, Pasuk 10. Sikrav el ha'ir le'lochem aleha. When you draw near to a city to fight it, v'karasa eleh l'shalom, you should proclaim peace unto it. So before Israel, a Jewish army rather, before it engages in warfare with an enemy, it should offer peace. Peace means an agreement from the other side to cease attacking, to surrender, and to put itself under Jewish authority. So this isn't peace, but you can stay independent. There's a decision here to make war. The Jewish people have an aim in engaging in this war, but if the other side is willing to surrender, then one should offer peace. This is halacha. Rashi is of the view that this is only in a milchemes reshus, in a voluntary war. In a war of milchemes mitzvah, meaning one, again, to remind ourselves, milchemes mitzvah means two categories. Either the conquest of Eretz Yisrael from the Canaanite nations, or other compulsory wars, such as against Amalek, or a war of self-defense. So in all those cases, you don't need to call out in peace, you don't need to offer peace, according to Rashi, for milchemes mitzvah. There may be other reasons why in the conquest of Eretz Yisrael peace was offered, but this isn't this halacha that we're talking about. This is only in a milchemes reshus, in a voluntary war. The Rambam, we touched on this in previous weeks and we'll see it again, believes that even in a compulsory war, peace should be offered. And I remind you again that this isn't the setting where we're going to look at length at the morality, for example, of the mitzvah of Mechias Amalek, of the destruction of Amalek. But the view of the Rambam is that if Amalek chooses not to engage in war and to surrender, and all they have to do is become, accept the Noachide commandments, accept the Sheva mitzvah Noach, which are very basic standards of morality, there's no mitzvah of Mechias Amalek. This Amaleki does not need to be destroyed. It's simply an expectation of a basic standard of morality. This is the first set of halachas. The next chunk, which I put in a separate box in the middle of page 3, is a halacha that when you wage war against a city and besiege it, you shouldn't destroy the trees in it. You shouldn't cause needless destruction. And we will see there are a number of reasons given for this opposition to needless destruction, either in order to avoid us damaging our own midas, our own character traits. In other words, we shouldn't engage in just wild destructiveness, or as a protection of Hashem's world, we shouldn't needlessly destroy Hashem's world, or because this is a war of conquest, and therefore have emunah, have faith, betochen, trust in Hashem, that this war of conquest will be successful, and therefore ultimately I will end up owning this land, and therefore why should I destroy my own property? These are the reasons put forward for this mitzvah. That's the second set of halachas. Finally, in source 3, I printed a pasuk from Parshas Matos. And it's an amazing thing. This halacha has become fantastically well known, even though its origins are a little murky. And in source 3, I printed a pasuk from Parshas Matos. The context of this is the war being waged against Midian. And the pasuk says, "Vayitzbu al Midian," you should war against Midian, wage war against Midian, ka'asher tziva Hashem es Moshe, in the manner in which Hashem commanded Moshe. And we have an oral tradition, very unclear where the oral tradition sees a hint as to this in the pasuk, but we have an oral tradition that this is talking about ethics of sieging, and according to one opinion, this means don't lay siege on all four sides. In other words, give an escape route to people who wish to leave the city that is being besieged. So let's have a look at this inside, because this is quite misunderstood, this topic. So with source 3, Vayitzbal Midian, they waged war against Midian, Kasher Tziv Hashem es Moshe. On that there's Sifri, which is a halachic medrash, again from the era of the Tanoim, it's an Itzik medrash from the time of the Mishnah. Hikifu Midalad Ruches. They besieged the Midianites from all four sides. This is the first opinion, that it is legitimate in warfare to besiege on all four sides. That's warfare. Rabbi Nosson is of the view, they gave to them a fourth side so that they could flee. So this is very, very interesting. It's a machlokas whether four-sided besieging is legitimate, or one always should leave an option to a fourth side being open. In addition, there's a machlokas, an argument, whether these halachas apply only to voluntary wars or even to compulsory wars. Now, remarkably, the Rambam Paskund, he ruled like Rabbi Nosson, who says you should not besiege on all four sides, and this is why this became so famous, this source. Normally, the rule would be that when you have an anonymous opinion first, this represents the majority opinion, and the named rabbi who argues on the anonymous opinion is the minority opinion. That's a very standard rule in the structure of Mishnayos. The first opinion we call the Tanakama, the anonymous Stam Mishnah, or in this case Stam Medrash, and the second opinion is the minority opinion. Nonetheless, the Rambam and Nachmanides, the Ramban, Paskin like this halacha, like Rabbi Nosson, that one should not besiege a city on all four sides. So this is the context or the background to this halachic discussion. Where does the Rambam get from to Paskin like this minority opinion? It's very strange, a little unclear. More than that, the text of the Medrash as we have it doesn't say that there's an instruction not to besiege on all four sides. It simply says this is what they did. Have a look at the Medrash again. It seems to just be a narrative. Hikipura medalad ruchas. Again, we're in a third of the way up from the bottom of page 3. They surrounded them from all four sides. Rabbi Nosson says, they gave them a fourth side, in order that they should flee. It doesn't say ten lahem, give them. It says they gave them. It's a narrative rather than an instruction. So all of this is background mystery to this source. Now, in source 4, which I printed on page, the top of page 4, I brought the Rambam where he paskins these halachas. Let's just very, very briefly try and highlight the core principles here. Number one, so this is Hilchos Malachim, the Laws of Warfare, in chapter 6. Number one, he says, I'm talking about whether it's, let's look at the English just for the sake of speed, war, whether Milchemet Harashut, a voluntary war, or Milchemet Mitzvah, a compulsory war, should not be waged against anyone until they are offered the opportunity of peace. And he quotes Devarim 20:10 that we looked at already. Number 7, we're jumping all the way through to number 7, but his introduction still applies. We're talking about both categories of war. When a siege is placed around the city to conquer it, it should not be surrounded on all four sides, only on the three sides. And then finally in Halacha 8, the halacha against cutting down a fruit tree, or in Halacha 10, any needless discussion. Okay, so far we have seen that the Rambam disagrees with Rashi. Rashi said all these heightened ethics of war only apply in a voluntary war, not a compulsory war. The Rambam says even in a voluntary war, even in an involuntary war, compulsory war, you have a heightened standards of ethics which Torah demands: call out for peace, don't engage in wanton destruction, don't surround the city on all four sides, etc. So this is the first chiddush in the Rambam. The second innovation in the Rambam is that he doesn't think this just applies to war. He thinks this even applies to individual fights. So, for example, if it's not a battle between states, but it's just taking out a terrorist group or whatever, the Rambam there is also of the view that we should call out for in peace. Look at what he says in Halacha Aleph. In fact, the English misses this nuance. I should change the English translation. The English says, "Ein osin milchama im odom be'olam." We don't wage a war against any human in the world, any person in the world. In other words, the Rambam is of the view that we don't wage war against even individuals without first offering them peace. That seems to be the simplest translation of what the Rambam says in this halacha. A number of sort of chedushim and how the Rambam learns this rule. In source 5, the Ramban says on the Rambam, why did the Rambam not list this as a mitzvah? So the Rambam lists 613 commandments, and the Ramban, Nachmanides, wrote footnotes on these 613 commandments, and occasionally he picks up on these points, and he says, I don't understand, one of the 613 commandments should be, call out in peace against an enemy, and don't besiege the enemy on all four sides. This is the question the Ramban asks on the Rambam. Now, we could answer the Rambam by saying that the Rambam doesn't think this is a specific mitzvah. He just encompasses this all in the general mitzvah of waging war. So there's a mitzvah to wage war appropriately, and within that there's a number of subsets. He doesn't list all the sub-commandments. However, there is an important source, a Meshech Chochmah, and I printed, I hope, the Meshech Chochmah on my, no, I see, I didn't print it on the ones that I gave out. Those who are following the source sheet online should have this, but I see on the hard copy I gave out, I didn't give the Meshech Chochmah. So I'll just say this outside. The Sefer Chinuch discusses these mitzvahs, and he asks, he asks, why are there these rules of ethical war? Why should we call out in peace, and why shouldn't we besiege on all sides? Let's just have a look at the Sefer Chinuch the Sefer Chinuch inside. This is source 6, and I'm going to ask you to jump straight to the second paragraph, which is near the bottom of page 4. Mishorshei HaMitzvah, the reasons for the mitzvah. And I'm just going to take you through this. He says, the Fisha Midos Harachmanos, the attribute of mercy, Midotova, is a good quality. V'roi lanu, and it's appropriate for Zera Kodesh, who are meant to be holy seed, to behave with this in all our affairs, even against enemies, who are pagans, because of the high standards that are expected from us. They may not be suitable for mercy, but we should always behave with mercy. So the first explanation that the Chinuch gives of this mitzvah is ethical behavior. Then he says there's also a practical consideration here. Because if you can win a fight without waging war, it's easier. So offer peace, sue for peace, give a suggestion of peace, and you get a number of advantages from it. It means that you may not have to fight, give them a chance to surrender. It means that they are now conquered, and therefore they can begin contributing to the national interest. They can become contributors to our national interest. And therefore this makes sense to do. Similarly, he says, why does it make sense not to besiege a city on all four sides? Beyond ethical considerations, is because it decreases resistance. Because if people know that they have a way out, they may choose the option of surrendering and withdrawing from the four sides. By the way, I should mention that the halacha of not besieging on all four sides doesn't mean that you let combatants out. It doesn't mean stupid. It means people have a route out in which they can surrender and hand in their weapons and accept terms. It doesn't mean allowing an attack from the rear because you're not blocking one of the sides. Okay, so this is the explanation of the Chinuch. Let's just carry on reading it inside. The gum, he says, so this is the second line of this middle paragraph. Besides the ethical considerations, it's of advantage for us. We'll now get workers who pay tax, who do the jobs that are necessary, without having to have the whole expenditure of battle. But if we kill them, what's he gain from that if they were willing to surrender? It will just be needless destruction. Okay, so says the Meshech Chochmah, Rameh Simcha of Dvinitz, that he is of the opinion that the reason why the Rambam doesn't list this as a mitzvah is because the Rambam doesn't believe that the halacha of not besieging on all four sides is a requirement. He believes this is a suggestion. It's wise advice. This section of halachas, based upon what we saw in the Chinuch and others, has a moral component to it, yes, but he argues that according to the Rambam, the primary motive besides this halacha is simply practical advice. It makes sense to offer surrender. It makes sense not to besiege the city on all four sides, because this is a way and an opportunity to more easily achieve one's goals without having to pay the full price of warfare. So this is the view of the Meshech Chochmah. Now, this is the view of the Sefer Chinuch. No, the Meshech Chochmah applies this as an explanation of the Rambam in explaining why the Rambam doesn't list as one of the 600 the commandments each. Okay, just a summary so we haven't lost our way over here. We have a midrashic source, amazing, not a posuk, that says you shouldn't besiege on all four sides. The Rambam, for reasons that aren't entirely clear, quotes this medrash, even though it seems to be the minority opinion of Rabbi Zobin, and even though it seems to be a narrative. Says the Meshech Chochmah, the Rambam never meant to quote this as an absolute halacha. He simply meant to quote this as wise advice, in line with the reasoning that the Chinuch perhaps put forward to this. And my proof, says the Meshech Chochmah, is that the Rambam doesn't list this as one of the 613 commandments. There is no commandment to not besiege on all four sides. It's simply a practical consideration if that's appropriate for the exercise of war. Now, this Meshech Chochmah entered into halachic literature, as I said, around the time of the siege of Beirut as part of the peaceful Galilee campaign. And Reb Shol Yisraeli argued that it was legitimate for Israel to besiege on all four sides. It did not need, in this case, to offer surrender. It didn't need to sue for peace, and it didn't need to offer an escape route where people could leave the city if they so chose. Why is that? Surely this war should be run in line with halacha. And again, remember the background in which this is either Milchemes Reshus or Milchemes Mitzvah, but the understanding that these halachas still apply nowadays. We don't have a melech, but we still have an executive that can make decisions. Surely the executive is obligated to follow halacha, which says that you should leave a side open. Says Reb Shol Yisraeli, This is simply Torah advice about how to conduct a war. It's not a halachic requirement. And therefore, if military situation dictates that this isn't so simple to do, or the judgment of the executive, the melech, or the government who is running the war is that this isn't an appropriate way to further the aims of the war, this doesn't apply. What will be the consequences? There'll be a siege. What's the consequence of siege? Tragedy. That's what happens when a city is besieged. But besieging is a legitimate war method. It's a legitimate method of war if this is the only way it can be carried out. The Torah tells us in a narrative medrash, according to the Meshech Chochmah's reading, that it is appropriate to consider the option of leaving a fourth side open. That's because it's appropriate to consider that may advance your military aims. But if you choose not to do this ethical conduct, or you don't believe it's in line with appropriate execution of the war, this is not an obligation to do so, and a siege with all the tragic and horrible consequences is a legitimate way of covering of carrying out the war. Says Reb Shlomo Goren, I'm not going with any of this. This is incorrect. You can't use a Meshech Chochmah as a commentary on the Rambam and a commentary on the Torah as a source for such a profound halachic statement, number one. Number two, if you look in the language of the Rambam, there's no indication that he doesn't view this as halacha. It's printed there, published by the Rambam in Perek Vav, the 6th chapter of the Laws of War. True, the Rambam doesn't list it as one of the 630 commandments, but we have another answer to that question because he didn't think it needed to be individually singled out. He just thought it was captured under a general rule called the mitzvah to wage war in an appropriate way. He doesn't need to break it down into all the detailed divisions. More than that, we have a concept of that we are not doresh tama dekra, which means to say we do not look at the reasons for mitzvahs and adapt our keeping of the mitzvahs based on whether we think these reasons are applicable or not. So we may have all sorts of nice reasons behind mitzvahs, but we don't say that affects the halachic working of the mitzvah. So the Chinuch and the Meshech Chochmah have come up with a nice reason for this mitzvah. They think it's not just ethical, but it's also the practical, that has a strategic value to it in order to allow a route out of a city. But you can't change halacha based on that. The reasoning behind this is called ein dorshim. We do not, doreshim means not in the sense of a rabbi's sermon, in the sense of use it as a tool of deriving halacha, hermeneutical principles. It's not a tool of deriving halacha. Ein dorshim tam lekra. The reason behind mitzvahs cannot affect the halachic applicability of the mitzvah, and therefore he does not think that a four-sided siege is legitimate, and he was critical of the idea. He applied this ruling halacha l'maisa. I mean, he was the chief rabbi. He was part of the conversations at the highest level in Israel. He was aware of the strategic decisions going, and he felt that in the siege of Beirut should not be surrounded on all four sides. We're going to therefore conclude with that simply by saying that obviously I'm not privy. Not going to go into any of the strategic decisions going on, and as I said, this is no attempt to comment on the particular events that are taking place. All I will say is that halacha does consider a siege a legitimate tool, whether it's compulsory to offer people exits from the siege or voluntary and only in certain circumstances remains a machlokus between Shlomo Goren and Shal Yisraeli. Depends whether we accept the Meshech Chochmah's interpretation or not. And more generally than that, we've seen two very leading figures who both take a slightly different stance. In this particular topic, Shal Yisraeli takes a slightly, we would say, a more hardline stance, a more right-wing stance, perhaps. He's more comfortable with civilian casualties, and he's more comfortable with a more aggressive form of warfare in which there's a four-sided siege. And Shlomo Goren, in both cases, takes a slightly more soft stance, and in both cases, he thinks that we need to be more cautious with the parameters that are there. But these are certainly important halachic discussions around the legitimacy of an extent of siege warfare and the like. I haven't managed to cover in this year destruction of resources. The destruction of trees in modern day warfare and destruction of other resources. Please God, in the final part of the series, we'll have a look at that. I'll wait for feedback about whether we'll look at hostages. If not, we'll look at also a very, very painful area of halacha, which is that of soldiers giving conditional divorces to their spouses before they head out for war, which is an exceptionally painful area of halacha. But I do feel comfortable talking about that because this again has old literature around it, already dating back to the First World War and Second World War and so on. And I'll try and share some thoughts around that. But for now, we've just used up our hour, so I'll stop here. I wish everyone a good evening.
Thank you, Dayan Zobin.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Nice to see everyone.
Amazing, Shir. Amazing.
Thank you very much, Terry. Thank you.